Hello, everyone. Welcome back, as always, to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and I welcome you if you are new or returning. This is episode 41. I feel like, I could call this the start of a new season, for multiple reasons pertaining to, well, the show and in my personal life. But, either way, I am very glad that you're here. And today I wanted to talk, less about practical magic, but something deeper. But before I go down the rabbit hole, I want to just let everyone know to go and check out my Patreon. It, of course, helps the show, but I also would love to connect to more of you. I have lots of things to get knee deep in. The link will be in the description of today's episode. And I actually just made a free accessible recipe for this month, really just in honor of getting ready for Welspurgisnacht. But yeah, go and check it out. But please stay and listen through for now. So, today I wanted to talk to, or well, I guess you listen to me blabber on, but I hope it turns into more of a discussion of some kind. I particularly have wanted to talk about this at some point in time, hearing some other perspectives on this general topic from other witches and many years of me just going back to this topic within my own craft. But it's the discussion of the language, we use, the symbols, the fears, and really the shadows and the moral frameworks and the techniques that, we apply to our magic that has been profoundly shaped by Christianity. And, as someone who talks quite openly about my own set of religious traumas, how so repulsed I was at some points in my craft to even think Christianity or any other Abrahamic religion or it had some sort of influence on witchcraft was really a hard pill for me to swallow for a very long time. But as one does, we grow, we mature, and even the fact that, in my humble opinion, a good witch challenges their own minds, their own beliefs at some points within their journey. Stagnation within the craft is really death. And if we do not challenge ourselves, those little parts of our power, no matter what they are, I find they become necrotic and they fall off. So, as I have become more and more aware of the online community within the craft, there is a story a lot of people love to tell themselves, and that is the comforting story of thinking or believing what the practice that you practice is the old religion, untouched, never influenced, and older and more pure form of witchcraft. And to me, it really stinks of this sort of elitism, but I think a lot of people take this approach not to always feel better than everyone else or to even feed their ego, but maybe because it's hard to believe that witchcraft as we know it today has been majorly influenced by religion and it is undeniable. So many of us choose to just ignore it. While I'm not here to say all traditions have been tainted or changed as a direct result of Christianity, because of course there are exceptions and there always will be, but again, for the majority, this is the point. I personally had a hard time coming to terms and accepting the pure fact that witchcraft was not just affected by the damage of Christianity, but it's truly been shaped by it. There wasn't just persecutions. It helped create the modern concept of the witch. It didn't suppress folk magic. If anything, it helped to preserve it through transformation. And I know that's a conversation that's pretty big within many spaces, but the next biggest thing I want to yap on about in this episode is not just if Christianity influenced the craft, because it did, but what do we do with that? How do we practice authentically when the very tools we're using have been perhaps placed by the clergy in, well, a metaphorical or even an actual way? Uh, so after, that this long-winded intro, I think an honest look at a complicated inheritance could be a good little brain teaser for the witch who is listening. So I want to start by talking about the Canon Episcopi. This document is from around 906 CE, and it was compiled by a bishop named Regino of Prum. I think that's how you say it. Within the text, it mentions women who believe, they ride at night with the goddess Diana or with Herodias, and they believed to fly through the air. They attended gatherings. So the church argues, well, I guess more or less states that these women are just deluded and the devil has sent or has shown them these fantasies and basically said that they're just big fat liars and that this isn't real. The gatherings, the flying and much more. So the church held this position for centuries of passing on the message that witchcraft is superstition. And I think a lot of people don't really realize this. It never started with um the fact that the church just said witchcraft is evil, witchcraft is bad, and it became this big thing, right? Before they had to switch the narrative, they really just told you you were crazy and it was just an error that you believed in these things. The response often was this pastoral correction, sitting people down and revealing that the devil has shown them great deception. These fantastical things again were just pushed off as this error, like, oh, you're just mistaken. There was no real threat for the witch because it was known to just not have existed. Now, of course, as we remind ourselves of the tried and persecuted of the witch hunts many, many years later, uh, there had to be a moment where the church had to backpedal because you cannot just punish someone for something that you claim isn't real. Well, I'm pretty sure King James did just that, right? First he said it was nonsense, but then the woman who whispered to him, the very words he told his wife on their wedding night frightened him so much that he deemed witches were indeed to be real. And, that's how all that stuff started. But before King James, there are writings of Johannes Nider, who published the Formicarius in the 1430s. Without going into all the deep details, it was really one of the first texts to call out women specifically to be more susceptible to the allure of the devil and witchcraft due to our inferior little brains. But also, it brought, to the attention of many that witches were something that turned from, only being used by these educated higher up males to the idea that any person could perform acts of magic by just devoting themselves to the devil. It was no longer just only accessible by ceremonial magicians of higher status. So then Pope Innocent the Ninth hops on the bandwagon of announcing witchcraft as real and, a threat and really authorizing the inquisitorial action against it. Then, of course, the Hammer of Witches takes the stage. So all of this to say, or to get to the point where I want to reiterate the pact that we all know of, right? The witch pacts with the devil. A formal contract with Satan himself is, of course, a Christian theological invention. It is not the man at the crossroads. It is not the folk devil. That much I think I covered on this podcast, but from night riding to the wild hunt, fertility cults, fortune telling through divination, the church took all these separate, diverse, and well, regional practices and traditions and really just compressed them into one narrative of the Witches' Sabbath, a really unified conspiracy, and of course, a coherent enemy. But, that brings up the implication of the word itself. Many of us call ourselves witches. Many use it because there has been this big revival, this reclamation, and nowadays with the internet, I think people more than anything think it's empowering or even just cool. But witch was derogatory. It wasn't good, even if you did practice all the same thing. There was a point where the title really mattered. It was largely defined by the people who wanted to eradicate every so-called witch, and even now, the modern identity of the witch in books and film and media is directly constructed by Christian demonologists. So I pulled quite a lot of notes for this part because I want to walk through the timeline of suppression. I think it just really shapes the story for how traditions have changed as a direct influence of Christian doctrine. So, to start, when Rome became Christian, the legal apparatus of the empire was turned against the non-Christian practices. So, laws were passed, temples closed, and of course, many, many practices were reclassified. What had been normal religious activity started to become criminal, and it was a careful and systematic pressure that started to um, erase, things that we really don't even know went on because those who kept the most vital records were usually rewriting what they were conquering. So Charlemagne, introduced a decree when conquering the Saxons that prescribed death for refusal of baptism. There was forced conversion backed by military conquest, and it happened all across Europe at different times. And then, of course, it reached across the sea to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific. So we have this creation of this administrative infrastructure from a couple hundred years before the witch hunts. It defined and punished deviation from orthodoxy. So when the Inquisition, when originally established to combat the Cathar heresy, it adapted these procedures to cases of alleged witchcraft. There is a complication, of course, with the simple narrative that quote Christianity destroyed the old ways. Of course there is, right? It's not to say many things did not survive. They of course had to put on Christian clothes at times and blend in to survive. The adaptation, what looked like hiding, was more strategic than what it first looks like. It was truly a survival strategy, is I guess my point, while preserving what they could, even if it had just changed. So, of course, when we get to the conversation of gods and goddesses becoming saints and ritual festivals becoming holidays on the Christian calendar, I've mentioned these things before. Uh, Briefly, I think the most well-known and most talked about is probably Saint Bridget of Kildare, originating from the goddess Bridget with the same feast day. This perpetual flame at Kildare was once tended by priestesses of the goddess, now tended by nuns of the saint. You know, the practice continues. So there are cases of holy wells too. Across Britain and Ireland, these pre-Christian springs were sacred and eventually rededicated to the religion. Then we have the argument of Samhain and All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, of course, the winter solstice and Christmas, and all the other Sabbaths people love to argue and spread misinformation on across the internet. But truly, if you take the time to look a little deeper rather than claiming it was some quote pagan holiday first, the intermeddleness, I guess, just made that word up, becomes more complicated where we want to believe religion starts and where it ends. There's a part that I think many of us maybe refuse to look at, and that's just the Christianization of charm magic too. So, like Anglo-Saxon and medieval charms, healing formulas, protective spells, this agricultural magic were written down in manuscripts alongside Christian prayers and biblical texts. And the charms themselves incorporate Christian elements, invocations of Christ, the Trinity, specific saints, psalms, of course, used as incantations, and the sign of the cross as a magical gesture. And these aren't Christian prayers that happen to just look like spells. Over time, I've, of course, recognized that they really are spells, that have been dressed in this language. The structure is magical, the repetition, the specific gestures, the material components, the timing, but of course, the words now invoke Christian powers. The practitioners weren't confused about what they were doing. They were doing magic. They were just doing it in a way that, the only language that was safe. And maybe many witches are aware of this, but just don't take it a step further to try and practice these things. Now, of course, you don't have to, but I think there is something rich here to be learned from. And of course, changing the names and introducing your own adaptation of it, just utilizing the procedures even. Uh, but I'll talk about adaptations later, but you can't just take it, change it, and say it's an original piece of old magic before the Jesus loving freaks got to it. That's just not the case here. And so there's argument of the Bible itself as a magical object. Now, I do believe this is quite talked about a lot, and it challenges the neat separation between, Christian and magical that a lot of people want to maintain. Personally, this is something I am newly using in my witchcraft. I have been aware for a little while now, but only just mustered up the courage to actually begin and weaving and experimenting with this in my practice after a dream connected to an ancestor that I had. Now, bibliomancy itself is the divination of opening, the Bible at random and reading whatever passage your finger lands on, placing a Bible under your pillow for protection or prophetic dreams, swearing oaths on the Bible to bind them magically, and using specific psalms as spells. Psalm 23 for protection, maybe Psalm 91 for deliverance from evil, or Psalm 109 as a curse. This is a very traditional folk practice. And I do have to say, my own experience with Psalms have been very positive so far, even after tweaking it a little bit. Now, removing the Christianity from these traditions doesn't reveal a hidden magical pagan core underneath, or, I'm not even pagan, but that's just what came to my brain. But, something more purely magical and mysterious. It actually sort of destroys the tradition, in my opinion. Now, I do have some arguments on changing and adapting things, so that is not something just to take purely at face value, but what I mean is, the Christianity isn't a disguise in these practices. It is it needs to be recognized as this load-bearing wall. And, if you adapt these things for your own practice, I just urge you to keep in mind and accept it for what it is and how it was originally used. This is something, again, I had to tussle with for a bit, especially when I was feeling so called to start to use these things. But it was a little bit uncomfy for a little while. I have to say that. These moments of the craft show up for me as my magic progresses and changes for these practitioners. The Psalms are the spells. They were the spells. The saints are and they were the spirits. And the Bible was essentially the grimoire, right? That's not syncretism in the sense of hiding something uh, older than Christianity, but that's magic that is more genuinely, sincerely Christian in its cosmology and um magical in the essence of the practice. Both things actually are true at the same time in this case, I think. So this is why this conversation, I think, is a little bit, not a little bit, really nuanced. And learning to hold both of those truths simultaneously is one of the most important things this episode, I think, can teach us. On grimoires specifically, the majority of them are deeply rooted and just heavily influenced by Christian traditions. Blending this Orthodox theology with occult rituals, of course, we have the classic Key of Solomon. It opens with prayers to the God of Israel, invokes the Tetragrammaton, Adonai, angelic hierarchies, prescribes psalmic recitation within these conjurations, and the operator is assumed to be working within a biblical framework. It's just assumed. The authority they claim, the authority to command spirits, comes from God, from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, in the sworn book of Honorius, the operator swears oaths in God's name, uses psalms and angelic hierarchies, conducts rituals that presuppose Christian clerical categories. The seals, the prayers, the structure of these invocations, it reads like a liturgy because it basically is a liturgy repurposed for magical ends. Now, the Book of Abramelin and even ones like the Grimorium Verum and Grand Grimoire operate within a Christian cosmological framework. The demons they conjure are Christian demons. Fallen angels, the protections they use are Christian protections. The sign of the cross, the names of God, the authority the operator claims is the authority of God over the fallen angels. Without that framework, the magic just doesn't work, at least not within its own logic. So there will always exist this paradox of the church condemning magic, but the magical tradition was deeply Christian. The same institution that burned witches produced the theological framework within which ceremonial magicians operated. The magician and the inquisitor shared this same cosmology. They agreed on the existence of God and angels and demons and really the reality of spiritual power, but they disagreed on one thing, and that was who was authorized to use it. So modern witchcraft today has had really no choice but to evolve directly from this side of history. It is so deeply entwined, almost like the existence of the battle of good and evil, like God and the devil himself. It is really quite difficult to trace back to a time where one did not exist without the other. And if there is, well, it's not the interpretation of witchcraft that we see today. It is most likely just oral traditions, folk practices of their own culture, which now we can interpret as a magical practice. Most of these folk practices back then were never called witchcraft, and those practicing it were never ever called witches. They were seen as healers, medicine people, cunning folk, and very, very quite often utilized the Bible and Psalms and invoking the powers of God, Jesus and Mary and saints and so on and so forth. And I would really argue sometimes, at least what I see on the internet, a lot of people choose to not look at this part of magic, or even, the great conversation of well, you can't call yourself a folk practitioner if you don't even know where it comes from. Who are the folk that your practices come from and all that. So it calls for you and it takes you to actually look deeper at those folk practices, especially if you're going to go ahead and say that you practice folk magic, right? Because uh, you can't cherry pick these things. And if you do, then I would just argue it's not very authentic. So when, it comes to arguing of this sort of ghost in the machine, I guess I would call it, the Christian frameworks, maybe we don't realize that we're using. I don't want to blab too much on about the whole black and white magic thing because I know I did an entire episode on it, and I shall point you in that direction if you wish to hear my thoughts on it. But it's really a direct result of what is accepted and what is not. There is also this fear of demons that I want to point out as well. Maybe many witches still somewhat, sort of, maybe just a little bit, have this fear of demons, or at least I think it is still kind of this taboo topic. Um, and even hell and opening doors to evil forces. Sometimes that holds you back from taking one step too far within your magic because you think it might be a little bit too much. And this doesn't have to even um, be uh, part of the whole demon conversation. It could be any part of witchcraft that maybe you are holding yourself back from because you think it just might be a little bit too far. And I argue, that's a direct reflection of religious conditioning. So within the PGM, practitioners work with daemons, with spirits, without the moral terror that characterizes Christian demonology. A daemon is a spirit. It can be helpful or harmful, but it is not inherently evil. It is not a fallen angel. It is not an agent of Satan whose goal is the damnation of your immortal soul. The entire framework, the fallen angel, the tempter, the a being whose very nature is evil, that is the Christian theology. It is not a universal feature of magical practice. It is not how magical traditions in human history have understood the spirit world. And once you begin to understand this and see the differences, your magic reflects that through its own evolution. So I'm not saying there's nothing to be cautious about in magical practice, because of course there absolutely is. Discernment is real. Not every spirit is friendly. Not every working is, of course, the most wise one, but there's a difference between discernment and this inherited terror. And of course, I do have another episode I would love to touch on just about this topic, of the real cost of witchcraft, at least if you're not just throwing spells around casually, but I digress. I've begun to notice how pervasive the religious trauma within witchcraft and the occult communities can be. And, I would venture to say that the majority of people who come to witchcraft, especially those who come into it as adults, are coming from some sort of Christian background that they experienced as harmful, limiting, or abusive. They're coming to witchcraft not just as a spiritual practice, but as a form of healing, a form of liberation, even, or rebellion, and a way of reclaiming their own spiritual authority after having it denied or controlled by religious institutions. Now, of course, there's the argument of people just leaving Christianity because they don't like certain things and they want to just go into witchcraft because they think they can do this and that without the same sort of uh, moral challenges that it brings upon if you are truly digging deep into yourself. But again, that's different. But to a point, this is understandable, right? It's very logically understandable. Christianity, particularly fundamentalist and evangelical Christianity, has done enormous damage to people's relationships with their own bodies, sexuality, their own spiritual experiences, their own sense of personal authority and worth. This is nothing new. It has taught people that they are inherently sinful, that their natural impulses are evil, that their spiritual experiences are suspect unless they've been approved by this proper religious authority, and it has used fear of hell and damnation to control behavior and these concepts of divine judgment to shame people for just being human. So, when you grow up in that environment, when you've been told repeatedly that you're a sinner who deserves eternal punishment, when you've been taught that your body is shameful and sexuality is dirty, when you've been forced to suppress your own spiritual experiences in favor of this approved doctrine, of course, the discovery of witchcraft can feel like coming home after a lifetime of exile. It can feel like finally being allowed to breathe, finally being allowed to trust your own experiences and being allowed to see yourself as sacred rather than sinful, especially if you fall into the the Wiccan pipeline or the uh, earthly goddess kind of area, which I think many of us kind of start off in. But, I completely understand why people want their witchcraft to be as far removed from Christianity as possible, especially when they first start. When Christianity has been the source of so much pain and limitation in your life, the last thing you want to hear is that your spiritual liberation is somehow connected to the thing that you're trying to escape from. You want your witchcraft to be pure, to be this idyllic, ancient, untouched by a religious system hurt you. And you want it to be the complete opposite of everything Christianity represents in your experience. Or maybe you just expect it to be the complete opposite because that's what we've been taught to see. These two opposing opposites of Christians and witches. The problem is that when we let our trauma responses dictate our spiritual choices, we end up limiting our own access to spiritual technologies that could actually serve our healing and empowerment. So we end up making decisions based on fear and reaction rather than based on what actually works for our spiritual development. And I personally spent years rejecting anything that had any connection to Christianity, anything that reminded me of the religious environment. I mentioned this in my Gods and Saints episode. I was so hesitant to work with deities. For some reason, the spirits I worked with, I didn't connect to this overarching higher being, such as deities are within even the online occult spaces. I think everyone kind of puts deities, or everyone has their own um, opinion or viewpoint of how they see deities. But it's very easy to first discover working with deities and see these devotees and see how people worship them and they're so devoted. It's very much of the same scary thing of like devoting your life to Jesus when you see people devoting their life and worshiping other gods. No matter how different they are, the act of it was very much the same, and it was pretty triggering, for some people. Um, but eventually working within that own framework and uh, understanding the way that you personally view deities and spirits uh, can help change that. But that being said, I remember being physically uncomfortable when other witches would mention working with angels or using psalm magic or incorporating any kind of Christian symbolism into their practice. It felt like betrayal, like collaboration with the enemy, like allowing the thing that had hurt me to infiltrate the space I had created for my own healing. But that reaction, while understandable, was also limiting me because some of those Christian influence techniques are incredibly powerful and effective. And by rejecting them categorically, I was cutting myself off from magical technologies that could have served my own spiritual development. So I was allowing my past religious experiences to, continue controlling my choices just in a different way. Beginning to work with Psalms, and I've mentioned working with Saint Expedite, and yes, the Catholic Christian argument comes in here, but it's the doctrine that I rejected. It has healed more parts of me that I actually was afraid to really look at, and it sort of, um, I guess, like powered up my magic in ways that really excite me again. The healing I discovered wasn't in rejecting everything connected to Christianity. The real healing was in developing enough spiritual sovereignty to be able to evaluate practices based on their actual effects rather than their historical associations. Now, it was, in that learning to separate the techniques from this sort of institutional context in which I had first encountered them. It was in developing the confidence to work with whatever spiritual technologies I could fit and see serving my highest good, regardless of where they came from or what they reminded me but I had to learn, accept, and remind myself of its roots. Um, you know, I had to face the hard truth, that uncomfortability of opening up my book of Psalms, of even thinking about purchasing a Bible again, of even working, with saints and buying a statue and making an altar for this for Saint Expedite, and of course starting to experiment with psalms within my own magical means. It took a while for me to feel like I was still being authentically a witch. So, of course, your healing process is your own, and you get to choose what serves you and what doesn't, but the choice should be based on conscious discernment rather than unconscious reaction. And, it shouldn't be projected onto other practitioners, of course, who might benefit from techniques that don't work for you. One of the things I've learned about trauma is that it creates these rigid patterns of avoidance that can actually perpetuate the original wound. When we're in a trauma response, we tend to organize our entire lives around avoiding the very thing that reminds us of its original experience, but we develop elaborate strategies for staying away from anything that might trigger the old pain. And in the context of spiritual practice, this can mean that we end up organizing our entire magical practice around what we're not, um, rather than, what we are. We define ourselves as non-Christian rather than defining ourselves by our actual spiritual values and goals. We spend so much energy avoiding anything that reminds us of what hurt us. In this case, it would be the fact that Christianity really shaped witchcraft, at least in the modern sense, that we don't develop a clear sense of what we're actually drawn to or what actually serves our spiritual development. And, I see this pattern constantly in online witchcraft communities. People spend enormous amounts of energy policing the Christianity out of a certain technique or practice or even some folklore and even other people's practices. You know, they, God, especially when the like Wheel of the Year and the Sabbats come around on Instagram, it's ugh, I just roll my big fat eyes at it sometimes. But they they really pick at what they don't want. Or I should say, they know what they don't want, but they're not really clear on what they do want. They're running away from something rather than running towards something. And this creates a kind of spiritual stagnation that actually um, mirrors some of the problems with institutional Christianity. Instead of developing personal spiritual authority based on direct experience and practical results, people end up following new orthodoxies about what is and what isn't acceptable in witchcraft practice. Instead of thinking for themselves, they defer to the opinions of course, online influencers or even book authors about what constitutes, quote, real witchcraft, and not spending any time evaluating practices based on their actual effectiveness, their own history and origins. They evaluate them based on whether they fit the approved narratives about this fake ancient purity. This is just another form of spiritual authoritarianism, and it really replicates some of the same dynamics that, of course, made Christianity harmful for so many people in the first place. So the content is different, but the structure is the same. Someone else is still deciding what's spiritually acceptable. People are still being shamed for practices that don't fit with the approved model, and personal authority is still being subordinated to this collective orthodoxy. The irony is that this approach actually gives Christianity more power over our spiritual lives, not less. When we organize our entire practice around avoiding anything connected to this, we're still letting, of course, Christianity be the organizing principle of our spiritual lives. We're still giving it power to determine what we can and can't work with. We're just sort of doing it in reverse. So, discovering what this spiritual freedom kind of looks like to me, what it feels like, involves being able to separate these techniques from the institutional contexts in which you first encounter them. It involves developing enough confidence to trust your own discernment about what works and what doesn't, even when the discernment leads you to conclusions that don't fit other people's expectations or even your own original expectations. The way we change within the craft, I think, should mostly surprise ourselves at the end of the day. The moment I work with Psalms for a working or choose to approach another saint or do a simple charm that came from the Bible or just recognizing the folk ways of even cleansing my house that came from my abuela has procedures to call on God and Jesus and Mary within the prayers. I can actually do it now fully and wholeheartedly without the rejection anymore, not by accepting Jesus into my heart, but by accepting the magic of it. This means developing the ability to hold this complexity. It means being able to acknowledge that the same religious tradition that has been the source of enormous harm has also been the source of genuine spiritual insight and effective magical techniques. It means, being able to recognize that human spiritual experience is very complicated and, of course, contradictory at times, and that wisdom and healing can emerge from the most unlikely sources. If, you know, 14, 15-year-old me practicing looked at my practice now, my 13 or 14-year-old self would probably look at my practice now and be pretty surprised with some of the things. Like, what do you mean we're adapting a psalm for this certain working or spell? Or Abuela, prayed to who when casting out the demons in the house? Like, what do you mean? When we kind of looked at her as this um, very witchy uh, woman who did not call in the powers of God and Jesus and Christianity to get rid of these more fantastical, magical things within the home. So, of course, religious trauma is real, and it's a very important uh, part of yourself to respect when you start to think deeper about the very conversation that we're having about this and how it has influences uh, upon the witchcraft of your own practice. And it's very personal work. It's work that each individual has to do for themselves with whatever support and resources serve their particular process. But it's not work that can be done collectively by eliminating all triggering content from even shared spiritual spaces. And frankly, trying to create a trauma free spiritual community is impossible and very counterproductive and just fucking stupid. Every spiritual tradition, every magical practice, every religious symbol has been the source of harm for someone. It's just like you can't please everyone. If we try to eliminate everything that could possibly trigger someone else's religious trauma, we end up with spiritual communities that are so sanitized and generic that they can't actually serve anyone's deep spiritual needs. The solution isn't to create spaces where no one ever encounters anything that reminds them of past religious harm. The solution is to create spaces where people are supported in developing the resilience and the discernment they need to navigate their own healing process while also being exposed to the full range of human spiritual expression. So, this means creating communities where people can be honest about their trauma without having their trauma responses treated as universal truths. Stop being a big fat baby and just face the truth. But creating spaces where people can explore whatever spiritual practices serve them without being policed by other people's triggers and developing the collective capacity to hold both support for individual healing and openness to spiritual diversity. So, to get into the conversation of the online spaces when it comes to this sort of thing, navigating these complex realities within the communities seem sometimes more interested in the ideological purity and um, I guess than actually in the practical spiritual development itself and building authentic magical practices that acknowledge their real historical influences while still serving our spiritual needs can of course get convoluted and pretty messy when navigating it online and with other practitioners, but I would like to think, these aren't just theoretical questions, and I don't think that they should be theoretical questions for everyone who's actually serious about their magical practice. There are questions that affect how we learn, how we teach, how we build the community, and ultimately how we develop as spiritual beings. Sometimes I see this online space caught in a kind of adolescent rebellious phase, like a teenager who just defines themselves entirely in opposition to their parents. Maybe uh, practitioners are defining their spirituality entirely in opposition to Christianity without developing a mature understanding of what they're actually for rather than what they're against. And this adolescent phase serves a purpose, of course, just like it does in individual psychological development. It helps people separate from harmful influences, develop their own sense of identity, and claim their own authority. But it becomes problematic when it gets stuck there, when communities never mature beyond the reactive phase into something more constructive and generative. And even if this isn't a conversation about the community itself, but if you find yourself thinking this way about yourself and about your own magic as it starts to evolve, the of course the internet has made this problem better and worse. On one hand, it made it possible for practitioners to connect with others who share their interests and approaches, and regardless of location. So we have this ability to reach out, to share, to connect to others, and there's this diversity of online spaces that means most practitioners can find some sort of community of people who understand and support their particular path. And of course, on the other hand, the internet has also made it easier for toxic dynamics to spread and become entrenched. Ideas that might have remained localized in pre internet days can now achieve global reach through social media algorithms that reward engagement over accuracy. And misinformation about historical practices go viral and become accepted wisdom before anyone with actual expertise can provide corrections. And the anonymity and distance that characterize many online interactions can make it easier for people to be, of course, cruel and judgmental in ways that they probably wouldn't be in face to face communities. But the result is that, we have online witchcraft spaces that are simultaneously more diverse and more polarized than historical magical communities ever were. Uh, you can find communities dedicated to almost any conceivable approach to magical practice, but you can find communities where the level of ideological policing and social pressure would even make a fundamentalist church jealous. This fragmentation isn't necessarily a bad thing. Having diverse communities means that different approaches to spiritual practice can develop and flourish without being forced into conformity with approaches that don't serve them. But the fragmentation becomes problematic when it prevents practitioners from learning from approaches that are different from their own, or when it creates such a strong tribal identity that people become more invested in defending their particular approach than in developing their actual magical skills. We need to challenge not only our own minds, but be open to our minds being challenged by others and us challenging other minds as well. And really, I think maybe part of the problem is that many people are coming to witchcraft looking for community and belonging as much as they're looking for spiritual practice. And, these two things don't uh, always align well. The techniques and approaches that serve your spiritual development might not be the same as the techniques and approaches that are accepted by the community that you necessarily want to belong to. Um, there's that argument, but also spiritual practice and the way you practice and your techniques and how you communicate with your spirits and how you choose to execute certain things is deeply personal. And those are the things that aren't necessarily always good to share or beneficial to share, I should say, as, maybe going into church and everyone prays to God the same fucking way. It's just not the same. It doesn't translate the same. Okay, before I rant, after everything that we've discussed, historical complexity, some trauma responses, community dynamics, even purity politics, the question I really asked myself at the end of the day when I started to have this realization was, what do we actually do with all this? What do I do with this? How do I practice my witchcraft authentically when I understand that some of the tools and techniques have been shaped by centuries of this cultural exchange, adaptation, and of course, Christian influence? How do I move beyond the paralysis of this sort of perfectionism and the limitations of reactive avoidance to develop my practice that actually serves my spiritual development? This is where theory meets lived experience, where the messy realities of history start to translate into practical decisions that I make every day about how to approach magical work. And of course, I'm going to be honest and say this is not easy territory to navigate if you're coming at this with some sort of level of religious resentment. Or, you know what, even if you are just one of those people who refuse to believe that Christianity has influenced witchcraft in any way, shape, or form, it requires being willing to sit with the uncertainty, to make nuanced judgments, to, hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without rushing to resolve them into these sort of simple formulas. It's also some of the most rewarding spiritual work you can do because it leads to a kind of authentic sovereignty that can't be shaken by other people's opinions or even uh, new discoveries or political changes. Authenticity doesn't mean historical purity. We've established that such purity is largely mythical anyway. Authenticity doesn't mean following someone else's rules about what real witchcraft looks like, and it doesn't mean rejecting everything that makes you uncomfortable or that challenges your existing beliefs. That's just spiritual bypassing. But creating this sort of authentic practice, as I understand it, means developing a approach that genuinely serves your highest development as a human being, that connects you to real sources of wisdom and power, that produces results within your life, and that contributes to your capacity to serve something larger than your own ego. So, of course, that means being honest about what works and what doesn't work within your actual lived experience, regardless of what you think should work based on any sort of theoretical or ideological consideration. And it means taking responsibility for your own spiritual development instead of depending on external authorities to tell you what you should or shouldn't be doing. It's like the argument of taking all these spell books and just copying, pasting, and doing it exactly as you're told. There's no real growth. There's no real evolution in that. Of course, it's wonderful for reference and for learning from, but it really takes you stepping up to become the witch that you need to be to create your own practice. And this is really a skill that gets developed through the practice, through making the mistakes, through paying careful attention to the results of these experiments over extended periods of time. It's not something you can learn from those books or videos, although like I said, those resources can provide very useful frameworks for thinking about discernment, but it's something that you develop through direct engagement with spiritual practices, with your spirits, with your ancestors, with your communication, with the actual practice of gathering materia, finding what works and what doesn't. This careful observation of effects on your consciousness, on your behavior, your relationships, and really your overall well being. When I first started working with, say, just Psalms, I had to navigate exactly these questions of discernment and authenticity. Of course, like I said, I had spent years developing a witchcraft practice that was deliberately constructed to avoid anything that reminded me of Christianity that I had grown up with and eventually rejected. My practice was built around what I understood to be pre-Christian elements, these mythologies and folklore that I cherry-picked. Seasonal celebrations tied to agricultural cycles, spirit-focused communion instead of the big D word, deity, nasty dogs, that I associated with the big G word. Herbs and stones and natural magic that felt ancient and earth-based and, safely removed from the religious context that had caused me so much pain. But I kept encountering references of Saw magic and the folk traditions that I was knee deep in. Shit, I even mentioned earlier, some practices were recently passed down to me from a family member, and they are direct prayers to Jesus and Mary for warding, spiritual cleansing, fertility magic, not just casual mentions, but detailed descriptions of how specific psalms were used for protection and healing and prosperity, and of course, cursing work. These weren't Christian prayers that happened to have magical applications. They were clearly magical techniques that used biblical verses as their core technology. The structure, of course, is magical. The methodology, of course, is magical, and the results are magical. The only thing that was Christian about them was the source material and, of course, its origins. My initial reaction was complete resistance. I felt like it could never fit me because I believed, this either had to be a sort of corruption of older pagan techniques, I guess, or a trick to make magical practice more palatable to Christian authorities. I spent considerable time and energy trying to find quote original versions of some techniques, trying to figure out what these practices had looked like before they were contaminated by Christian influence. And really, the more I researched, the more I realized that this approach was both historically naive and very, very limiting. Many of these psalm magic techniques developed within communities that were genuinely Christian in their worldview, practitioners who saw no contradiction between their magical work and their religious faith. These weren't pagan practices in Christian disguise. They were Christian magical practices developed by people who understood the Bible as a source of spiritual power that could be accessed through specific technical methods. So, yes, I started to understand, that my resistance to these practices was being driven more by my own emotional reaction than by any rational evaluation of the techniques themselves. I was rejecting potentially very effective magical methods because they reminded me of the religious context that had, of course, been harmful for me. And, my past religious trauma was dictating my present spiritual choices, which meant that in a very real sense, Christianity was still controlling my life in some sort of little fucked up way. And once I found it, it was like, ah, there you are. That's where you've been hiding all this time. But, when I finally worked up the courage to actually use a psalm for the first time, it actually didn't feel like a betrayal of witchcraft at all. It more like felt like a deepening of it. The techniques integrated naturally with the other aspects of my magical work. The energy of the practice felt clean and very supportive rather than oppressive or controlling. And most importantly, engaging with this Christian derived technique actually strengthened my sense of spiritual autonomy rather than undermining it, because I was choosing to work with it based on my own discernment rather than having it imposed by this religious authority. So, this experience, taught me several crucial lessons about navigating an authentic practice that have continued to guide my spiritual development since then. First, that effectiveness is way more reliable of a guide to authentic practice than looking for some sort of historical purity or this ideological consistency. The psalm magic worked consistently and powerfully, regardless of its Christian associations. Rejecting it based on those associations would have meant cutting myself off from genuinely useful spiritual technology. I talked about this again about working with saints and deities and gods and spirits. Just because you think it has relations to a religion that you don't identify with doesn't mean it can't work for you. The second thing is that spiritual authenticity requires taking responsibility for my own relationship to the practices rather than allowing the relationship to be determined by external factors. When I worked with the Psalm magic, because I had evaluated it carefully and determined that it did serve my spiritual needs, I now look back and I realize that was exercising a sort of sovereignty. I avoided it because I was afraid of its Christian connections. I was allowing past experiences to um, in turn control my magic. And I think that's the part that really got me fucked up. Like I was pretty mad. I was like, no. I'm not gonna let my fear of Christianity taint my power, my magic in any sort of way. So I think just a switch sort of flipped in that moment. But also, I realized, this sort of spiritual power doesn't respect the arbitrary boundaries that our minds create between different religious traditions or magical systems. The same forces that can be accessed through Celtic invocations or planetary magic or herbal spell work can also be accessed through these biblical verses. If you know how to work with them skillfully, of course, the techniques are just different doorways into the same underlying spiritual realities. And maybe that's just like so off the rocker to say or think about. But, this doesn't mean that all spiritual practices are equally effective or equally appropriate for every practitioner. Of course, some techniques will resonate with you in your particular temperament and circumstances, while others won't. And some will serve your development at certain stages of your journey, but become less relevant than as you grow and change. The key is just learning to make these distinctions based on your actual experience rather than, uh, I guess, what you want them to be. So, of course, when you're developing this kind of discernment in this experimental stage, it really means being willing to try practices that challenge your assumptions, to work with techniques when you're not sure even why they work, to evaluate methods based on their fruits rather than just the foundations without looking deeper. Now, of course, I think the most important part of this whole conversation is the fact that we should and really have to recognize and accept that it does have these foundations. So even as I choose to use Psalms, and if that involves adapting the word God into something else, now do whatever you want. And some argue to adapt some, and some argue don't. But I will say this is one of the advantages of understanding the historical development is recognizing that adaptation and innovation have always been a part of how spiritual techniques evolve and remain relevant. The practitioners who developed folk magic traditions were constantly adapting their methods to new circumstances, incorporating influences from different sources, and modifying techniques based on their results. When working with psalm magic, for example, I don't simply recite the verses as they appear in standard biblical translations, not always. I took the time to study some Hebrew originals and learn to work with the sound patterns and the numerical relationships and give the verses their magical potency. I've developed personalized visualization techniques that enhance the energy of the verbal formulas, and even creating, talismanic applications that extend the protective influence beyond the immediate time of recitation. So these adaptations don't represent a departure from authentic tradition. They represent the continuation of an innovative process through which these traditions developed in the first place. So the goal isn't to preserve techniques in some pristine historical form, because that's not even how we've gotten them. That's not how we have them even now, but to work with them in ways that maximize their effectiveness for contemporary practitioners operating in a contemporary circumstance. Let's just not kid ourselves. Like, this is the modern world. you know, when exploring saint veneration, for example, um, I personally don't approach the saints as objects of religious worship within a Christian theological framework. Instead, I work with them as I would work with any other spiritual ally, developing personal relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocity, making offerings that they appreciate, asking for assistance with matters within their areas of expertise, and expressing gratitude, of course, for their help received. So, the fact that these figures developed within Christian culture doesn't make them inappropriate allies for non Christian practitioners, any more than working with maybe Celtic deities makes you a Celtic polytheist, or working with planetary angels again makes you some sort of ceremonial magician. Spiritual allies can be approached through various cultural and, of course, theological frameworks, but even working with, grimoire magic that really operates within Christian cosmological frameworks, focusing on the underlying magical technology rather than getting distracted by this sort of surface language. Now, I'm way less of a witch to practice ceremonial techniques, but honestly, they do find their way into some of my practice here and there. But looking at techniques for constructing magical circles or invoking spiritual forces or creating talismans and commanding spiritual energies can, of course, be adapted within different frameworks while preserving their effectiveness. So, as I wrap this up, of course, I want to stress again the key is maintaining respect for the original traditions. The whole point of this conversation is to come to terms with the fact that a lot of the witchcraft techniques and folk practices that we see today do come from Christianity. They do come from religious frameworks and the result of the doctrine being imposed on many, many, many generations of magical practitioners. Accepting the balance of this requires both humility and confidence. Humility to acknowledge the wisdom embedded in traditional practices, even when their contexts are foreign, and the confidence to trust your own discernment about how those practices can best serve your particular path. And it doesn't make you any less of a witch. So being honest about the sources of our practices and processes through which they developed, rather than creating mythology and ancient purity that doesn't match historical reality. When we're honest about the complex and syncretic nature of traditional magical practices, we create the space for contemporary practitioners to work with the same complexity more creatively and essentially just more authentically. Now, this brings me to say what I think might be the most important insight from everything I've blabbered on about today is the recognition that finding that authenticity is really about integrity in the sense of wholeness, of integrating all the influences and experiences and sources of wisdom that have contributed to your own spiritual development into a more coherent approach that just ultimately serves your magic for the highest good, really. Not to get all love and light, but it is what it is. It means holding multiple perspectives sometimes simultaneously without actually needing to jump on and resolve them into a single simple worldview. It is very convoluted and it's complicated. Magical and navigating the witchcraft space is always changing, and it's uh, It means sometimes being comfortable with paradox and complexity and being able to work with um, things that you never thought you'd maybe work with. Drawing from multiple cultural sources without claiming membership in those cultures and adapting traditional methods without losing respect for their origins. Of course, I hope all of that is just already known and I don't have to harp on it, but this complexity is not a problem to be solved. It's more of a natural condition of spiritual practice, and that leaves the question of, not whether we can practice witchcraft in exactly the same way that our ancestors did, because we want to believe it was some sort of untouched thing from Christianity and it's so freaking magical. Oh my God. No, we can't. And honestly, we shouldn't want to. The question is whether we can engage with the spiritual technologies they developed in ways that serve them the same fundamental purposes, connecting us to sources of wisdom and spirits and power that transcend our ordinary consciousness, helping us to navigate life's challenges in greater skill and resilience, and enabling us to contribute to the healing and the transformation that our world desperately needs. And even if that means fucking cursing someone, I don't care at this point. But, when we approach traditional practices with that kind of practical spirituality, we're more interested in what works than in what looks authentic. We are more concerned with actual spiritual development than with belonging to particular communities or maintaining these sort of identities that we want to grasp onto so tightly. We become capable of working with the fuller range of this spiritual wisdom. And you just become more powerful. Your witchcraft becomes more potent. Your magic works better. So here we are at the end of this long, winding conversation. I don't know if there's anything else on the top of my head that I feel like I should mention at this point, but I do want to say if you stayed with me through all of this, through uh, maybe a little bit of uncomfortable truths about Christian influence on witchcraft, the discussion of religious trauma as well, just thank you. It would be so much simpler to stick with clean narratives about pre-ancient traditions and evil Christian oppression, maybe even more comfortable to organize our little spiritual lives around avoiding anything that reminds us of these harmful religious experiences. Uh, but what the fuck is the fun in that? There's no fun in that. I really argue anyone uh, who has successfully avoided all contamination of problematic influences and honestly claims of unbroken lineage back to some imaginary golden age of pure practice is just bullshit. But it takes challenging your own mind and beliefs to find techniques and recognize harmful ideologies, holding complexity and again that paradox without needing to resolve them into simple, easy to eat, bite sized pieces. Learning from sources you have complicated relationships with and not afraid to adapt things without losing respect for its origins. The witch you are today is, of course, not going to be the witch you were 5 years ago, or hopefully not even the witch that you'll be 5 years from now. Your practice should be evolving as you evolve, adapting as your circumstances change, and deepening as your understanding grows. The techniques that serve you at one stage of your spiritual life may become less relevant, and that's okay. That's nothing that you should want to try to hold on to if it's not going to serve you any longer. This is not a problem to be solved, but the natural condition of witchcraft. And, well, if that's not happening to you, then you're doing it wrong. But really, thank you. Thank you to everyone who tuned into today's episode. And if you stayed to the very end, sorry, it was a bit of a long rant and I guess maybe some hot takes. But either way, thank you so much. And of course, wherever you are in the world, have a wonderful morning, day, or night.